At 68 years old, I thought I understood the rules of family loyalty. I believed that love meant endless giving, that sacrifice was the currency of affection, and that saying no to family was selfish. For 5 years after my husband's death, I lived by these beliefs, pouring my resources into my adult children's lives like water into sand, watching everything disappear without acknowledgement or gratitude. The house felt enormous without him, its rooms echoing with memories of laughter that had long since faded. In the silence, I convinced myself that financial generosity could fill the void left by his absence. Every check I wrote felt like proof that I was still needed, still valuable to the family we had built together. My son had inherited his father's charm, but none of his business acumen. Where my husband had built success through careful planning, our son stumbled from one failed venture to another. His wife possessed expensive tastes and an uncanny ability to make their problems sound like temporary setbacks that family support could easily resolve. The requests began modestly after the funeral. A few thousand for medical bills, help with car payments, assistance with the children's school expenses. Each appeal came wrapped in gratitude and promises of repayment that gradually transformed into assumptions of ongoing support. I wanted desperately to feel useful, to maintain connections that seemed to be slipping away. Over 3 years, I had given them nearly $500,000. Not loans, despite the initial language, but gifts that were never mentioned again once the checks cleared. When I once gently inquired about repayment, my daughter-in-law looked so wounded that I immediately apologized for bringing up something so crass. The manipulation was masterful in its subtlety. They never directly demanded money, but every conversation circled back to their financial stress, their worry about providing for the children, their fear that they couldn't maintain the lifestyle that would honor my husband's memory. I was made to feel that my wealth was a family resource I was hoarding selfishly if I didn't share it freely. My grandson was different. At 25, he possessed his grandfather's quiet wisdom and genuine warmth. When he visited, he asked about my health and interests, not just my bank account. He had dreams of opening a bookstore, a modest ambition his parents dismissed while pushing him toward corporate positions that would generate the income they felt the family deserved. My granddaughter was planning her wedding, and naturally, my son and his wife assumed I would fund the entire celebration. They didn't ask for my contribution. They simply began making plans that required my financial backing. When I expressed concern about escalating costs, my daughter-in-law would tear up and explain how important it was for the bride to have the perfect day. The wedding planning consumed months of my life and tens of thousands of my dollars. My daughter-in-law included me in every decision, making me feel valued, but my preferences were invariably overruled in favor of more expensive alternatives. The budget climbed steadily from reasonable to extravagant, each increase presented as necessity rather than choice. The ceremony itself was undeniably beautiful. My granddaughter looked radiant, and her new husband seemed genuinely devoted. For a moment, watching them exchange vows, I felt every dollar had been worthwhile. The reception that followed was a display of luxury that bordered on ostentation. Crystal chandeliers, celebrity chefs, gold-rimmed china. Every detail proclaimed wealth and sophistication. I should have felt proud, but instead felt increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed. Something about the way my son and daughter-in-law moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations for their obvious prosperity, made me realize how completely I had been erased from the narrative of success I had funded. The moment that shattered my illusions came during the speeches. My son rose from the head table, champagne glass glinting, and began what I expected would be a heartfelt toast to his daughter. Instead, he turned the spotlight on me in a way that made my blood freeze. He announced to over 200 guests that they owed this magical evening to someone very special. His mother. he proclaimed with theatrical gestures, was not just the bride's grandmother, but the fairy godmother who had made the celebration possible. Without her incredible generosity, her open checkbook, and her dedication to being the family's personal bank, they couldn't be celebrating in such style. The actual spotlight swung to illuminate me as polite applause rippled through the crowd. Some guests chuckled at his joke about the personal bank. I felt my face burn with humiliation as I forced a smile. This wasn't gratitude. This was public mockery, disguised as appreciation. I had been reduced to a punchline. My daughter-in-law joined him at the microphone, her smile bright and predatory. She announced a special surprise for the newlyweds that I had supposedly arranged. As a token of the family's love, she declared, grandmother had graciously agreed to fund the couple's dream honeymoon in an exotic destination. The crowd erupted in applause while I sat paralyzed. I had never agreed to any such thing. The honeymoon had been mentioned in passing as something the couple hoped to afford someday. Now I was publicly committed to funding it, trapped by social pressure and the impossibility of contradicting them in front of their friends. My granddaughter rushed over to embrace me, her joy genuine and infectious. She thanked me through happy tears for making her dreams come true. Her happiness was real, which made the manipulation even more painful. She had no idea her parents had just cornered me into a commitment I never made. An older gentleman approached my table during the dancing. He had been my husband's attorney and close friend. Without mentioning specifics, he asked quietly about my current situation, whether I was comfortable with recent developments. He handed me his business card and suggested we meet soon to discuss certain provisions in my husband's will that might be relevant. The next morning brought harsh reality. My son and daughter-in-law arrived without warning, immediately launching into excited discussions about honeymoon packages. My daughter-in-law thrust a tablet showing luxury resorts, each more expensive than the last. The least expensive was $15,000, but she favored a $25,000 package with private accommodations. When I quietly mentioned that I had never actually agreed to pay for any honeymoon, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. My son's face darkened with anger. He began pacing, explaining how embarrassing it would be if I backed out. People would think the family was having money problems. My daughter-in-law tried a different approach, settling beside me with tears gathering. She spoke about how hard they had worked to create the perfect celebration, how meaningful it had been to see me honored. She reminded me how proud my husband would be to see his family united. For decades, this emotional manipulation had worked flawlessly. I would feel guilty for causing distress, ashamed of my selfish concerns, and eager to restore harmony by providing whatever they requested. But something fundamental had shifted during that humiliating moment at the reception. Whatever the cause, I heard myself saying something I had never said before. No, I told them quietly but firmly. I will not pay for the honeymoon. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. My son stopped pacing and stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. They had never heard me refuse a request, and clearly had no strategy for dealing with this resistance. My son's response was immediate and frightening. He stepped closer, his face flushed with rage, and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks. His voice dropped to a threatening whisper as he told me I was making a serious mistake. The family had appearances to maintain. I couldn't simply decide to become selfish after years of doing what was expected. The physical contact crossed a line that even years of emotional manipulation had never breached. I looked at this man I had raised and loved unconditionally, and saw someone I barely recognized. The mask of charm had slipped, revealing something ugly and entitled underneath. Before I could respond, my grandson appeared in the doorway. He had planned to visit after the wedding, and his timing couldn't have been more providential. His face went white when he saw his father gripping my arm, and he immediately stepped between us, demanding his father release me. The confrontation ended with my son and daughter-in-law storming out, but not before delivering a final threat. They would find other ways to get what they needed. If I wanted to remain part of the family, I needed to remember where my loyalties belonged. After they left, I sat trembling. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally standing up for myself. My grandson made tea and sat with me while I processed what had happened. He encouraged me to contact the attorney who had approached me at the wedding. The conversation with my husband's lawyer proved revelatory. He had been waiting for me to contact him for nearly a year, watching my financial statements with growing concern. As my husband's oldest friend, he felt obligated to inform me about certain provisions in the will that had not yet become relevant. My husband had been more observant than I realized during his final months. He had watched our son's business failures and growing entitlement with increasing alarm. He had witnessed the subtle ways my daughter-in-law manipulated situations. Most importantly, he had recognized that my kind heart made me vulnerable to exploitation. The lawyer opened a sealed envelope that my husband had entrusted to him. Inside was a codicil to the will I had never known existed. My husband had included provisions that would be triggered if any heirs engaged in behavior designed to manipulate or financially exploit me. The language was specific and comprehensive. If the codicil was invoked, it would immediately redistribute our son's inheritance to other beneficiaries, primarily my grandson and granddaughter, with substantial portions going to charitable foundations. The decision to trigger this provision was mine alone. But once made, it would be irreversible. Reading my husband's words, written during what must have been painful contemplation of his family's future, brought tears to my eyes. He had anticipated this situation and tried to protect me even from beyond the grave. The man who had loved me for over 4 decades had understood that my greatest weakness was my inability to see myself as deserving protection. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. My son and daughter-in-law tried different approaches to convince me to reconsider. They sent my granddaughter to plead with me, which was particularly painful because her disappointment was genuine. They had told her I was going through a difficult emotional period. Instead of capitulating, I had a private conversation with my granddaughter about the situation. I explained that her parents had made promises on my behalf without permission, and while I wanted her to have wonderful experiences, I couldn't reward the dishonesty that created this expectation. Our conversation marked the beginning of a different relationship, one based on honesty rather than financial transactions. My son and daughter-in-law escalated their efforts when gentle manipulation proved ineffective. They began visiting daily, attempting different emotional approaches. The visits became increasingly uncomfortable and intrusive. They would arrive without calling, help themselves to food, and settle in for hours of circular arguments about my obligations. The final straw came when I discovered my daughter-in-law photographing my personal financial documents with her phone. When I confronted her, she claimed she was only trying to help me organize my affairs. She suggested that managing such a substantial estate was becoming too difficult for someone my age. The implication that I was becoming incompetent was the ultimate insult. I realized they weren't simply interested in accessing my money. They wanted to control it entirely. They were laying groundwork to challenge my mental capacity if I continued resisting. I contacted my husband's attorney immediately and told him I was ready to invoke the codicil. The process was straightforward but emotionally devastating. The most difficult part was accepting that my son had become someone willing to destroy my independence for money. The legal confrontation took place in the attorney's office on a gray Tuesday morning. My son and daughter-in-law arrived confident they could convince me to see reason. Instead, they found themselves facing a formal legal proceeding, listening as my husband's lawyer methodically documented their behavior over several years. The lawyer presented the codicil with my husband's original signature and detailed instructions. The document was legally unassailable. My son and daughter-in-law's attorney advised them that challenging it would be expensive and unlikely to succeed, given the documented evidence. The moment when my son realized his inheritance was permanently gone was seared into my memory. The anger and disbelief on his face gave way to something worse than rage. It was the look of someone who had gambled everything on a strategy that had just collapsed completely. They left without speaking to me. I sat in the conference room for several minutes after they departed, feeling simultaneously liberated and heartbroken. I had protected myself, but the cost was the relationship with my son that I had spent decades trying to preserve through financial generosity. The immediate aftermath was surprisingly peaceful. My son and daughter-in-law disappeared from my life completely. No angry calls, no attempts at reconciliation. They simply vanished, presumably to rebuild their lives within their actual financial means. My grandson visited more frequently during this transition, understanding I might need emotional support. His parents' absence allowed our relationship to develop into something genuine and mutually respectful. My granddaughter took longer to process the situation but eventually reached out to apologize for her unwitting role in pressuring me. 6 months later, I began discovering who I was when I wasn't constantly responding to other people's financial crises. I had interests that had been dormant for years. I started taking art classes, joined a book club, and began volunteering with literacy programs. I also began supporting my grandson's bookstore dream with both financial investment and hands-on involvement. Unlike the endless money I had poured into his parents' failed ventures, this felt like genuine partnership. He had a solid business plan and valued my input as much as my financial contribution. The bookstore opened 8 months later, quickly becoming a beloved community gathering place. Working alongside my grandson gave me purpose I hadn't felt in years, and the success validated my belief that money invested in genuine dreams yields better returns than money thrown at endless crises. A year after the wedding that changed everything, I received an unexpected letter from my son. It wasn't an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that their behavior had been inappropriate. He wrote that losing the inheritance had forced them to make difficult changes that had ultimately been beneficial. 2 years later, I established a foundation in my husband's name to support small business entrepreneurs and literacy programs. The foundation allowed me to channel my desire to help others in ways that created positive change rather than enabling destructive patterns. The foundation work introduced me to inspiring people building meaningful enterprises. These relationships reminded me that generosity could be both wise and effective when it supported people who valued assistance, rather than demanded it as entitlement. My relationship with my grandson deepened as we worked together on both the bookstore and foundation. He had inherited his grandfather's business acumen and integrity. Watching him build something valuable gave me hope for the family's future, even if its structure looked different than I had once imagined. 3 years after the wedding, I attended my granddaughter's graduate school graduation. She had earned her master's degree in social work while working part-time, refusing my offers of financial assistance because she wanted to accomplish this independently. Her pride was infectious. Looking back on those painful years of manipulation, I could see how my desire to be needed had made me vulnerable. My husband's protective provisions had given me tools to escape that dynamic, but the courage to use them had come from finally recognizing I deserved better treatment. The foundation work taught me that true generosity involves discernment and boundaries. The most loving thing I could have done for my son was to stop enabling his irresponsibility, even though it meant accepting the loss of our relationship in its previous form. My house no longer felt too large or quiet. I had filled it with meaningful activities, genuine relationships, and purposeful work that energized rather than drained me. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful, a space where I could think clearly and make decisions based on my own values. 4 years after the wedding, I was invited to speak at a conference about financial abuse in family relationships. Sharing my story was both difficult and healing. Many women were still trapped in patterns I had escaped, and my experience offered them hope that change was possible, even later in life. The foundation had grown into a substantial organization, making real differences in dozens of communities. We had funded over 100 small businesses and literacy programs, creating jobs and educational opportunities that continued generating positive impacts long after our initial investments. On the 5th anniversary of the wedding that changed my life, I hosted a small dinner party for the people who had become my chosen family. During the evening, someone raised a toast to my courage in making such difficult changes so late in life. I found myself thinking about whether what I had done really qualified as brave behavior. It had felt more like desperate self-preservation than heroic action. A recognition that continuing on the previous path would have destroyed whatever dignity and independence I had left. But perhaps that was what courage actually looked like for someone in my situation. Not dramatic gestures, but the quiet decision to stop accepting treatment that diminished my humanity. 6 years later, I was still living independently, actively involved in foundation work, still learning new skills, and forming new friendships. My relationship with my son remained cordial but distant. He had apparently learned to live within his means and seemed to have developed a healthier relationship with money. My granddaughter had married her partner in a small ceremony that I helped plan and partially funded. But this time my contribution was requested rather than assumed. The celebration was modest and meaningful, reflecting the couple's values rather than anyone's desire to impress others. The foundation work had evolved to include educational programs about financial literacy and family boundary setting, helping others avoid the situations I had experienced. Teaching these workshops was deeply satisfying, particularly when I could see participants recognizing their own patterns and beginning to make protective changes. Sometimes I wondered what my husband would think of the changes I had made using the tools he had provided. I believed he would be proud of my courage in invoking the protections he had created, and satisfied that his foresight had enabled me to escape the exploitation he had feared. The woman I had become was stronger, wiser, and more discerning than the one who had written endless checks in pursuit of family harmony. I had learned to distinguish between love and manipulation, between generosity and enabling, between family loyalty and self-destruction. 7 years after that transformative wedding, I was reading to children at my grandson's bookstore when one asked what advice I would give to someone who felt like they always had to say yes to people they loved. I thought carefully before answering that love should make you feel valued and respected, not used and diminished. As I drove home that evening, I felt grateful for the circuitous path that had led me to this place of peace and purpose. The house no longer felt empty but full of possibilities. I had finally learned the difference between being loved and being used, and that knowledge had set me free to build the life I actually wanted, rather than the one others expected me to fund.